Hi guys, welcome to chapter 2, key issue 3. Sorry, it's late getting uploaded. Something happened and I had to redo it. So now I'm doing it right now and I'm already in my pajamas and my hair is wet and I'm not wearing makeup. So now you know we're getting comfortable with each other because now Mrs. Maddie is out of her element. So here we go. So we're going to talk mostly about forced versus voluntary migration and push and pull factors. We've kind of briefly talked about some of these things in class already, and this video is going to be super duper short. And then there won't be one for key issue 4 because that one's pretty straightforward, and we're going to have a discussion on that key issue anyway in class. So we're going to hit that one pretty hard. So after we get through all these, you can start studying for the test, which is going to be the day before you leave for October break. And then when you come back, we will be moving on to culture. Okay. So a little bit of migration demographics thus far. So migration and population are in the same unit because migrations affect population. Here's Teddy. Because people leave countries and that lowers their population, and people move to countries and that raises their population. So that's why migration is in the same unit. So you should think of migration just as another piece that demographers look at. Okay, migration tends to happen in waves or trends. And this gets confusing, and Ms. Gill will probably go over this with you too, but emigrants and immigrants are not the same thing. Hold on a second, my puppy's chewing my computer cord. No, Teddy. Okay, immigrants are migrants who enter countries, and emigrants are migrants who leave countries. So a lot of people use those interchangeably, and they're not the same thing. So be smart people and don't mistake those. Okay, so types of migration. We've talked about internal migrations, intra and interregional migrations. But now we're going to talk a little bit about international migrations, and I'm not going into these too much because you guys are going to have lots of examples and information about them with your projects. But since I am running into issues where people have some questions because they haven't learned this stuff yet, I thought I'd go over a few things, just a few basics about migration. So voluntary migration is when migrants choose to move. And almost always when it's voluntary migration, it's for economic reasons. So it would be for economic push or pull factors, okay? So like one of the largest migration waves in the world today is from the U.S., from Mexico to the U.S., and you can see here's this trend right here. It's been steadily increasing since 2002, but then in 2008, you guys will notice it starts to decline, and that's largely because of the recession that we had in the U.S. There weren't enough jobs for Mexicans to come up and get because even Americans were having a hard time getting jobs. So since then, it has actually been slowly declining, despite what I know it gets a lot of political attention today, but actually migration to the U.S. is on the decline. But still, it's still a sizable wave, a much more sizable wave than others in the world. So, so usually Mexicans come here for economic opportunities. There are other Latin American countries that come to where they have migrants that come to the U.S., and those can be for other reasons. They could be because of fear from drug cartels and political unrest and things like that. So those would actually be forced migrations and not voluntary migrations. But for the most part, most of the immigrants we get entering the U.S. are for economic reasons. So forced migrations are the ones that we spend the most time talking about. There's lots of different types of forced migrations, and I would say a goal for you guys is you should be able to explain the different types of migrations and give at least one example of each, okay? So forced migration is exactly what it sounds like. It's when migrants don't have a choice. They're kind of forced to leave their home countries and settle in a new country. So different types of forced migration. Slavery is almost its own type. A lot of that is for economic reasons, but not on the people who were actually migrating. It's on the people who owned the people who were migrating, right? So I almost call slavery like that's almost an example all by itself, okay? And then we have we have environmental factors like natural disasters. Political factors would be things like wars, ethnic cleansing, religious persecution, things like that. And then something else, when a migrant is looking for safety in another location, we call that asylum. So an asylum seeker is somebody who is searching for safety, and those people are refugees. Okay, you probably have heard some talk about refugees if you watch the news, and that simply means that they are forced to migrate, and oftentimes it's like they get out as quickly as possible, and they aren't totally sure where that asylum is. So it can be a process. Lots of refugees spend a lot of time in limbo where they're not settled in a new country. They are staying in refugee camps. We're going to watch a video on Syrian migrants in class in a couple of days, and that will give you lots of good examples as well. Okay, so just in case it hasn't been clear thus far, push factors is what makes migrants leave. So war in Syria, the push factor is a war, right? It's a political push factor. And the pull factor is what makes them settle where they settle. Lots of people settle in the U.S. because of economic opportunity. So that economic opportunity is pulling migrants to the U.S. And here's just some examples. So transatlantic slave trade, as I mentioned, I almost call this its own migration. I don't classify it in forced or, I mean, it's definitely forced. I don't classify it in like political or economic because I think it's almost got lots of different factors in it. Trail of Tears, definitely a forced migration, and I would call that a political migration, a political push factor. And the reason is because I think sometimes we think that political has to have something to do with the government, and although this was the U.S. government that forced this to happen, sorry, my doggies are crazy. Also political, the heart of it is just about power. So anytime there's somebody overpowering somebody else, wars are all about power. Oh, get lost, you guys. Go over there. That would be a political push factor. Partition of India. I know that groups have this in class for the migration project, so they'll probably explain this to you more later. But a partition is when a border is created. So in India in 1947, there was a border created right here between India and Pakistan. The majority of India was Hindu. There was a minority of Muslims, and since they were fighting, they made two different countries. And so if you were a Muslim living over here, then you had to move to Pakistan. And if you were a Hindu living in Pakistan, then you would have to move to India. So it caused this huge migration flux. Natural disasters. The potato famine would be considered a natural disaster. Okay, the potato crop failed, which means that people were starving and they had to move. It was a forced migration. It wasn't just because they wanted to eat something other than potatoes. Okay? And then these are very recent. So Hurricane Katrina, which happened in 2005, I believe, caused a lot of migrations out of New Orleans because people lost their homes. And a really sad story, lots of those migrants moved to Houston, Texas. And as you guys probably know, a couple of weeks ago, we had a really bad hurricane in Texas. We've also had one in Florida. So that was Hurricane Harvey in Texas, Hurricane Irma in Florida. And so anytime that happens, you see a lot of migrants coming out of those areas because people lose everything oftentimes. And rather than rebuild in the same location, oftentimes they leave to go start over somewhere else. Here's another natural disaster, the tsunami in Indonesia. This took place a couple of days after Christmas, and I believe it was 2012, but you might want to look that up. I don't remember at the moment. But it basically wiped out a bunch of residences in Indonesia, and lots of people left because of that. Here's a political push factor, the war in Syria. Any war would be considered a political push factor. War in Afghanistan would be a political push factor, okay? Ethnic cleansing. So anytime a group is, we're going to talk about ethnicities in chapter 7. So that's coming up right before Christmas break. But basically different ethnicities or ethnic groups oftentimes have conflict with one another. And when one is trying to push out the other, or there's war or political strife, that's ethnic cleansing, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's something that is happening currently in the Sudan. I guess that's all of my examples. One quick thing I wanted to show you really quick before we go. This is a really cool map that I found that shows you different migration waves around the world, okay? So the thicker the ribbon, the more people are migrating. So I want you to notice that there are a lot of people going from India to West Asia, which I thought was really, really interesting, or people going from West Asia to India. And since it's kind of hard to tell which one's going where, the other one I wanted to point out to you is in Africa. You will notice a lot of the movement in Africa is interregional, right? So it's just people moving to different parts of Africa. I thought that was really interesting. The most migrants in the world are in sub-Saharan Africa, okay? What's different, I think, and why that doesn't get a lot of attention, like we would assume they must be, the biggest migrant group in the world must be Mexico, because that gets a lot of attention, or it must be Syria, because that gets a lot of attention. But actually it's in sub-Saharan Africa. That's where most migrants are. The reason it doesn't get a lot of attention is because they tend to just move within Africa itself, okay? And then look at this, Mexico to the United States, right? Also a very big migration wave. Okay, yeah, now I see the arrows. It's India to West Asia. Actually, the UAE, the United Arab Emirates. I did not know that that was a migration wave. Very interesting. Okay, so I thought this was just kind of a cool thing to give you a feel for the different migration waves around the world. And that is it for today's lecture. So again, nothing for key issue 4. And get ready for the test. Be working on those cram sheets. You will have a chapter 3 vocab quiz before all of that is due. So get to work, everybody. See you next time.